also a fellow American that flew in from Washington, David Snelbecker, CEO of International Development Group, is going to talk about a little bit of history.
Thank you. My name is David Snelbecker. My group, International Development Group, works on economic reform programs. We are right now implementing the USAID trade policy program in Ukraine. Although today I'm going to speak not on behalf of the USAID project, just on my own behalf and my own observations. I've been coming to Ukraine now since periodically since 1990. When I first came in 1990, organized by some people at Harvard Kennedy School and some friends of theirs who thought it would be very important to bring economic ideas to Ukraine in 1990. One of the people who arranged those activities is a guy you probably heard of. His name is Bohdan Hawrylyshyn. He was one of the people I have who organized some of the early activities that I participated in a number of years ago. I want to talk about briefly three topics. One is some historical perspective on why it's been so hard to achieve reforms in Ukraine, for instance, compared to Poland, where things have gone much more quickly. Why is all of this very important? And some ideas for some basic principles for how to move forward and how to accelerate reforms. So a basic hypothesis I have is that Ukraine is a very advanced country in many regards, very high education levels in many regards, but historically the level of management is constrained by, or has been hurt by, Ukraine's history, and that the ability that public management is a very important factor in driving reforms. And if you compare Ukraine to Poland, the histories have been very different, and it's not only what's happened in the recent years, but if we go back in time, the extent to which Ukraine has not had the ability to have responsibility for its own public administration and public management at the national level has been extremely significant. It's historically constrained compared to Poland. And so I just want to look very briefly at the history of Ukraine, comparing it to Poland. I want to show a timeline, and in blue we'll show times when Ukraine had jurisdiction over its own policy, administration, governance, and brown when it didn't. So going back quite a ways to the golden age of Kyiv, everything was very good in Ukraine around 980 to 1240. It was the golden age of Kyiv. Kyiv was actually one of the more developed and centers of public administration in the world, and Kyiv and the extent of public administration was very good. Then, of course, on a rainy day in the fall of 1240, the Mongol hordes rolled in and sacked the city. And from 1240, for quite a long time, Ukraine had very little control over public administration, and instead was subjugated to the Mongols, to Poland, to Lithuania, to Russia, to the Crimean Khanate, to the Ottomans, and did not have the ability to develop public administration. There was some periods where there were opportunities for Ukraine to have jurisdiction over its own affairs under the Cossack Hetmanate, the Zaporizhian Sich, the independent Ukrainian republics. And then things went from bad to worse under the Soviet period. There were very many factors that severely damaged management in Ukraine. There is the Holodomor, the hunger, dekulakization. You think, who were the kulaks? The kulaks were managers. World War II, the Stalin's purges, centralization, which moved governance all to Moscow. These are not only horrific world events, some of the most horrific events that have ever happened in the world, but they also killed off the management class of Ukraine. And so it's not only what happened since independence, it's the 700 years that before that have given Ukraine very difficult initial conditions in which to govern a country. And then also an important factor of the Soviet period was ethnic assimilation. Ukrainians in the Soviet period fit in very well in Moscow. So if you were good at national management, you went to Moscow and you stayed. And at the end of the Soviet period, people like Aliyev went back to Azerbaijan, Shevardnadze went back to Georgia. Those maybe weren't the best managers, but they are kind of indicative of how managers return to their own countries. But people like Grigory Yavlinsky, Ukrainian, stayed in Moscow. So the initial conditions for Ukraine were extremely difficult without any managers. And then during independence, what I'm saying is not news to anyone. There has been a lot of effort focused on public administration. There's the Soros Group, USAID, the European Union, the International Management Institute. There has been a lot of focus on improving management over the last 25 years, but the previous 700 years are a big constraint. And then just very briefly comparing that to Poland, oops, the clicker seems to have stopped work up there. Okay, so if you click through Poland's history, I won't go into all the history of Poland, but during most of that period is blue. Poland had control over their own affairs, with some periods that were not very, where Poland was partitioned. Even during the Soviet period, Poland didn't have policy autonomy, but still, if you look at ministries, the Ministry of Transport of Poland basically ran transportation, whereas in Ukraine, there wasn't a Ministry of Transportation. There was just that it was autonomous. It was just part of the overall Soviet Ministry of Transportation. And then since independence, there was a lot of assistance from the EU and from donors to improve management. So why does all of this matter? I gave a similar presentation in the fall at a conference in Warsaw that was on the topic of the future of Europe, and it looked at EU integration and Brexit and lots of different factors, and one of the sessions was on Ukraine, trying to understand how does Ukraine fit into all of this. If you look at the recent history of Europe, since World War II, at the end of World War II, Europe achieved something very important. It achieved an area comprised of Western Europe that, after centuries of conflict, was finally free from conflict, governed by the rule of law and market economies. And then, after 1989, that kind of zone of freedom and market and rule of law expanded eastward. Central Europe also became free. After 1991 and the Balkan Wars, the Balkan countries and the Baltic countries also became free and governed by the rule of law and market economies, and kind of the chaos curtain was pushed further east. And then, of course, the next step in Europe's development is Ukraine. That if Ukraine also can decisively become a market economy and settle the conflict and push the boundary east, that is obviously very important for Ukraine, but it's also very important for Europe as a whole and for the European story of the last several centuries. So lastly, some observations on my views as to what are the 5 elements that are important for advancing reforms. One is that it's really important for there to be grassroots advocacy for reforms at the local level, so across the country. There's the famous saying, power never concedes anything without a struggle. It never did and it never will. Frederick Douglass. the reforms are not going to happen unless the people demand it. And the people can't be demanding kind of just general things like bread prices or electricity prices don't go up. It's very important for civil society to be engaged in advocating for specific reforms, specific laws, specific regulations, transparency, deregulation, anti-corruption, tax reforms, regulatory reforms, and to be engaged. Second, it's very important to work with national government structures. There have been times over the last 25 years when many Ukrainians and also donors have been frustrated with the central government and its ability or inability to move reforms forward. And I would say that Ukraine has kind of flipped back and forth between two conditions. One is when reforms are impossible because the central government doesn't want to do reforms, and the other is when reforms are possible but very, very, very difficult because reforms are very hard and there are constraints on public administration. Clearly, we're not in the former status right now, we're in the latter status. There's a genuine interest to do reforms, but they're still very hard. So, and if you only work at the local level, the problem is that when you ask local business people what are their main constraints, they're going to tell you that it's lack of contract enforcement, it's the tax regime, it's the over-regulation of the economy. It's all things that have to be decided at the national level. So it's really important to continue working at the national level. Third, general public administration reform and public administration education are very important, and slowly building up a bureaucracy and a Verkhovna Rada that has not only political abilities, but public administration abilities is very important. Fourth, it's very important to engage with the oligarchs. The oligarchs are still very influential. Ukraine is something like the in a historical moment that is somewhat similar to where the United States was, somewhere between the 1880s and the 1940s, when the United States moved from a country governed by oligarchs without the rule of law to a modern regulatory state. And part of that transition came from reform movements and people demanding reforms, and part of it came from convincing the Morgans, the Rockefellers, that they were better off in a state with an economy governed by laws, rules, regulations. And fifth, I think it's also digital tools are very important. The digital tools on the negative side allow governments to monitor the people increasingly, but they also allow the people to monitor governments. And so the extent to which there are NGOs and civil society and business associations monitoring government reform, government progress, looking at government websites, smartphones, looking at performance of government entities, all of that is a very important tool for putting pressure to advocate for reforms. Thank you.